Baughman joining you this morning along with Ben. Thank you to each of you for taking the time out of your Sunday mornings to join us on these Sunday morning webinars. We certainly appreciate you doing so. Just a couple logistics before we get started. If you're not familiar with this webinar platform, in the top right is a window for chatting. And the way that operates is you type something in at the bottom of that little box on the top right side, click send, and that will come over to Ben and I. And if you have questions or comments or ideas throughout the webinar, don't hesitate to plug them in there and click send, and we will share them from our end or respond accordingly. Another way to interact with us, which we certainly encourage you to do so, is at the bottom of the video. If you'd prefer to interact verbally, there is a button, I believe that says ask a question. You can simply type or click on that. We will see something come up at our end, and then we can turn the mic over to you and you can interact with us verbally as well. All right, I think that's it as far as logistics. Looks like the audio and video are working appropriately, so that's good. This morning we're covering 2 chapters at the end of part 4 in Ben's book Untracked, and those 2 chapters are experts and nickels and noses, which was a new term to me, and an interesting term that comes from Ben's world as a pastor for many years. I'm going to share just a couple of thoughts on kind of what jumped out at me as I read these couple of chapters, and maybe share my personal experience as well as another experience that I heard about that pertains to these 2 areas. But first, just a couple of things that jumped out at me. In the experts chapter, there's a couple sentences in there where he shares that I just want to be an expert in an area that fits my God design, an area that intrigues me, an area that keeps me up at night or wakes me up early in the morning, an area that gives me energy. Actually, I don't think he used these particular words, but my interpretation was an area that gives me energy and that I'm excited about to be an expert in. I think sometimes, and we talked briefly about this morning, Ben and I, as we were talking before we jumped on here, I think sometimes the word expertise, at least for me, maybe it's more because my experiences focuses into like the business world, or we have to have expertise in certain areas. But when I think about being an expertise in an area that fits my God design, an area that excites me and energizes me, that's very freeing to think about expertise in that area. And it was interesting how reading these 2 chapters together, because when I went to this next chapter about nickels and noses, which is basically we put our heart in, our heart follows our treasure follows our heart. So what is inside of us is eventually what will follow. And the excerpt that jumped out at me there was, if we can let that happen where our treasure is, where our heart is, we can focus on making God visible to the world around us. We can think and discuss and come up with means of making God visible to our friends, to our families, to our neighborhoods in ways that align with our strengths and with our giftings, which is exciting to me. And that makes me think of a situation years ago. Actually, Ben, Brenda, and I did a class called Living Life by Design, and it was I think a weekend workshop that we did. And I remember a gentleman that was in that with us that weekend. I chatted with him a number of times after that weekend as he was trying to fit all this into where he was at in his journey and his job, and he mentioned how his job has nothing to do with his design, yet as we talked more, he began to come up with ways and think of ways how his job can fit his design, or maybe it's just a different perspective on what he was doing and how his strengths and his giftings could fit into what he was doing. And it gave him a whole different perspective on his job, a job that he first did not like and did not enjoy waking up and going to every morning. Kind of changed that, where he became more excited. And it was what was really exciting for me is a year or 2 down the road, he ended up in a position that really did fit his design. So I think sometimes maybe we're in a scenario that doesn't really we think doesn't really fit our design, but just understanding more about who we are helps us understand what we can give into that scenario, and maybe eventually it even changes what we're doing from 9 to 5, if you want to put it that way. And I would also say that his experience was very similar to mine as well, where years ago I was in a job that wasn't really ticking for me and giving me energy, but when I kind of took a step back and went through some of these exercises where I discovered more about what are my strengths, what are my giftings, what keeps me up at night, and then how I could use that to give back to what I was doing in my job at the moment, which then later led to even bigger and better things for me as far as fitting into doing my job, fitting into my own design. So that probably went on a little bit longer than I anticipated, but those are some ideas and thoughts that came up for me as I read these 2 chapters. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ben, and he's going to share his thoughts on these 2 chapters.
Thank you, Karma, and thanks for your insight. As I'm looking at this morning, I'm thinking again how much we mirror our Western culture as Christians, as those that say we follow Christ, and yet we mirror the Western culture instead of um, the the way that Jesus actually lived. So the way we mirror the Western culture is we are corporate. We're corporate in our structures, where we follow capitalism because that's the means, our economic means. And within that context, our churches have the same structures because even our government systems, even our bureaucratic systems, are set up with these structures. So we have corporate structures in the religious world, and we incorporate, and we are not-for-profit corporations. And within that context, it breeds this whole piece of nickels and noses. As with all of capitalism, those become very, very important. And they're really important whether we follow capitalism or not in some senses. But to explain this, show what it means. If I'm a box store somewhere, a Walmart or a Kmart or a Macy's or anything like that, I better have money and people. I better have the nickels coming in because there's lots of people coming to my store to buy goods. And so the nickels and noses concept is a simply a capitalistic concept that says basically if we're going to if we're going to make it economically, if we're going to become a successful corporation, if we're going to be um, someone that makes it in the world as a business, then we have to have nickels and noses. That's just essential. Well, the church structure has the same thing. So it becomes very important that we have, if we're going to succeed as a church, that we have people coming in who have the ability to give us finances or give the nickels. So we have to have the noses and we have to have the nickels. And it becomes very important. And as I wrote in the book, it's not used so much in the business world. It was a term that was often used among leaders in the church. They would talk the nickels and noses concept. But it's interesting because what follows that is also this whole capitalistic and corporate idea that our expertise has to be in the areas that brings in nickels and noses. So what do we do when we advertise for jobs? We advertise the very things, the very um, uh, type of areas that we need to make sure that the noses are happy, the people are happy, and the nickels keep coming in. And so uh, when we even look at the church structure, we see that it isn't given to each person's design. The goal is not to look at it and say, look at people and say, oh, goodness, how did God design them? What happens is we begin to think in terms of what do we need to make our corporate structure successful. So we need good music. So we have to have good musicians, and we need uh, things that intrigue people and make it entertaining. So we have to have very good technical skills and be able to produce a good show. And we need to hold their interest. So our pastors have to be excellent speakers. And so the qualification to lead um, has to do with all kinds of things that are based around the corporate needs. And what has happened to us, of course, within that context, as we've followed that model, is that 98% of what comes in is spent to bring people back. It's spent to make certain that the corporation remains successful. Now, that's an interesting statistic, and it's a problem in this sense. And as you hear me say in the book, it's why I think we needed to start over. I finally hit a point from within where I said, I don't think I can turn this because the struggle to keep the corporation going was so great um, that all they could do was think about how do we keep growing, becoming bigger, that's the noses, and how do we keep the money flowing in to the corporation. Those two things seem to stymie, seem to stop cold this whole idea that God had designed a whole lot of people out there, all of us, with very unique designs, things that were needed in the world to make it better, to make it wonderful, to make it a place of salvation in a different sense than we view it in evangelical circles, but the kind of salvation that says, I'm bringing the gospel or the good news to people in the areas that are really good news to them. So I'm bringing hope to the single mother who doesn't know how to raise those three kids and make a good living and do the things that she would love to do in life, and the village that doesn't have water resources. What's good news to them? What's good news in Aleppo today to the children there? Would it be the bombing stopping? I think that would be the real good news, not that they all get to hear about Jesus today in a sense of did you give your life to Jesus or some terminology like that. But the real good news would be the bombing stopping for them and life to be normal again and maybe a good job and maybe safety and some security. See, those are the things that are the really good news. But the corporation doesn't give itself to those because what happens to us in the religious world as well as in the corporate world of business or in the government world or the education world, what happens to us is the success of the model is what's important. We have we have now churches that are so good at entertaining, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your strength and my strength gets to be brought out and elevated to a point where it can actually help other people, actually bring that strength to a world that needs it. And that's the difficulty with these corporate structures that we have, is they don't do what it is that Jesus led us to and the earliest of churches seem to follow. living out of the strengths, living out of the giftings, living out of the um, expertise in this different sense of each individual, living out of those things that kept those people's eyes alive. Each one of them, as they were able to bring to the table of this world, bring to the table of their neighbors, bring to the table of every place they went in the world who they were, the strengths they could give away. And when that happened, this whole idea of following Jesus spread like wildfire because these people were giving out of what kept them awake, kept them excited. And so, in this whole context, where our heart follows what we treasure, for so long we have been told that we must treasure the church but what we're really saying is we must treasure the corporate structure of the church and how it comes to us. So we're told that our expertise, what we need is people who are good in teaching Sunday school or people that are good in leading youth groups or people that are good in preaching or people that are good in technical things or people that are good maybe in administering in the church, in the finances, or in the programs of the church. But what do we do with all the people that don't fit the job description? Well, then what the corporate world wants to do is make them those that we draw in that consume what we have to give. And when they consume it, then their treasure or their money, if their heart is there, we go after their hearts. And then when their heart is there, we hope their money follows. But I think that we're living in a time when all of that's changing. And I'm grateful for it. Grateful in this sense. It's been a longing deep inside for as about as long as I can remember now, I think. Memory is getting shorter. But um, that people's hearts, their strengths, the things they treasure, the things that they are experts in because of their unique design, the things that draw them to giving their lives away in this world will come to the forefront again. And the corporate structures will take a back seat to that. And instead, we will just be encouraging people to give their lives away out of God's design in the world that needs it desperately. If that begins to happen, I think in the corporate world of church, we will see them less and less because the corporate world of church must maintain the nickels and the noses to keep the corporate structure going. So for those people, they will begin to let their treasure and their heart work together. And if their heart is for giving their lives away to the world, they'll want to start to put their treasure there. And the corporate structure becomes less meaningful, becomes irrelevant to them. And I think in these chapters that follow this, we will be exploring, and I would like us to really think deeply about what it can look like if that takes place. What it can look like when we center around people's strengths and we center around their expertise and we center around where their heart actually is and what they want to give to this world, what will that look like? I think there's a lot of up in the air about what that will look like. But I think there's a lot that we already innately know that will help us in that area. Any comments or questions, any thoughts as we look at this whole thing? I love this whole idea that everybody has an expertise. Everybody has strengths that God's given them. Everybody comes to the table, something that makes their eyes bright and keeps them up at night or gets them up early in the morning if it's allowed to come to the forefront.
We have a comment.
Yes.
We have a comment here that I love this idea, but I'm struggling with how to make it real practical. If I was to do what I was to design, if I was to do what was how I was designed, I'm not sure I could make a living doing that. How do I incorporate this idea of living life by my own design, yet still pay the bills?
I think that's really interesting and one that I don't know that I have answers for. It's one that I think we've got to talk seriously about. I know in my own life, um, this whole idea that I was designed to see big pictures, and I was designed to see uh, what was happening in the big picture of how the all of this affects us and what trends are happening now and what needs to come out of that and even how it affects us as the corporate world affects us or those type of things. There weren't a lot of jobs in those areas. And so I understand that. I understand from Paul the Apostle's perspective. When he left the world of uh, corporate religion that he was in, then it appears that he did things like making tents to earn a living at times when um, he needed to gain some extra money. And I know I do that as well. Um, Handyman services and so on. It's an area that I can do, and so do it and earn some extra money that way. But I don't know that I have the answer to um, can I make a living always doing exactly what my design is? And I think
And,
sometimes we may have to look at that from the aspect of can I live within the world I live in, making a living, and still live out my design?
and I would add to that a bit. I think too often maybe it's because I'm come from the business world. Too often I want to shift it to, well, how can I make a living doing that? Whereas if we discover our own design, maybe a better question is, what can I give to those around me in my current job or my current position or in whatever I'm doing, to share with them what's inside of me? So, for example, let's say, and I went through this struggle many years ago now, is thinking my job didn't fit who I was. Yet when I really began to understand my unique design, I could give to those in my current role, in my current job. I realized I'm creative and I love also to train others. So in my current position, were there newcomers coming on board where I can maybe give some input in helping them understand what's going on? Or was there a way within my current position, which I did find there was, to be more creative and to express my creativity inside of us? So I think even just understanding our design helps us accept maybe better where we're at. And I think understanding that will also potentially open other doors as we move forward. And also, there's another comment here that I do want to share with others because this is a great book, and I'm familiar with this book that this person mentions. An excellent book about doing the work you're created to do is Do the Work by Stephen Pressfield. He talks about spending a lifetime in a shadow career and overcoming the resistance to do the work you're created to do. And thank you for sharing that, because I'm very familiar with that book, and I would also encourage others to go explore the book called Do the Work by Stephen Pressfield. He has some other books out there too that are also very good. But it's about really just exploring who you are and sharing with the world who you are and overcoming that sometimes our own resistance to really doing what we're designed to do in the midst of our journey. So thank you for sharing that.
Wonderful, wonderful thoughts. And I think this is why I long for discussion so much. It isn't that I know from my position that I come at it feeling like I have answers always. Uh, Sometimes the whole of seeing this big picture is that it raises issues for us. It raises issues that need change and they need work. And uh, how important it is that we have those discussions, and how important it is that we get together and we say, how do we handle this? What do we do? Because we're not going to give up attempting to reach this whole concept again that perhaps we can live out our designs and that God intended that. And we have something to give to the world that the world needs. My goodness.
And I would also just add to that, I think if you're feeling a stirring inside of you, um, and maybe an uncomfortableness, if that's a word, inside of you, I actually think that's a good sign, because I think then we're paying attention to what is inside of us and why am I feeling this way, and is there something to be done about it? Maybe, maybe not. I think sometimes living life by our unique design is somewhat uncomfortable, and we live in uncertainty. And I think trying to be okay with living in uncertainty is part of the journey potentially.
That's really interesting. I think there is a tremendous amount of uncertainty, especially in the time we live, because we're changing eras. We're changing from this everything has been the same for a long time to a an unsettled feeling inside, the unsettled feeling of maybe this isn't the best because the world is changing around us. And with 7 billion people and so much going on, as we can see now with communication um, on a world perspective that we have instantaneously in front of us, we see and hear exactly what's happening, and it creates a stirring in us often, and we don't know what to do with it. We don't have the answers to it necessarily, but we know that things are changing, and we want to be part of that. What's good to make the world better. I think too, as we're looking at this, uh, and I was looking at this whole idea. Um, do you think that the institutional church itself can change to allow for this? I think that's a question that we have to look at. I think it's important to us to understand that question, and I'm not sure it does. Why I left it and why in some ways I had to leave my occupation um, because that was my occupation of the years, and I could do that, and I could still go back to that and make a living at it, but I can't anymore. Something inside doesn't allow it, so I've chosen another path on that one because I feel like somewhere we have to build something different that allows for the strengths and the giftings and the expertise of every person to come alive again, to give to this world a place that is better than they have. For many people, for some people, and lots of people, the world's a great place in the country we live in, but there's a lot of people even in our country that need to hear a message from all of the experts, all of the unique people of this world that God has designed to give them a message that in the corporate world doesn't come across. They need to be loved and cared for, and there needs to be resources to do that. Those are being eaten up now by the corporation. And I think I'd want to ask today, before we go any further.
I'm going to throw a comment in here.
Oh, okay.
Um,
Go ahead.
the comment is, I'm not sure if we can do this on the church level or the corporate level, but maybe it starts more with us as individuals or as families, or maybe with a group of friends in discovering what our designs are and how we can work together to make the world different or better.
And somehow I think you are exactly right that that's where it's going to have to start. I think I don't see it starting from the top down. I see it starting from the bottom up, just as you mentioned there. And I think I'd want to ask today, before we go too much further, do you have an inkling of what your design is? What kind of things keep you awake if you're talking about?
We have another comment that came in before you go too far down that path, hon.
Okay.
The comment is, do you think the institutional church is struggling with that issue now? I get the impression that some progressive evangelical churches are working in this area, but most institutional churches are not.
I, I'm going to speak to that from uh, the insider side, and I haven't been an insider for nearly 5 years now, but from where I looked at it, and now as well though, from still attempting to stay on top of things as far as from an outsider perspective, looking back in and reading periodicals and so on online that are still from the inside. Um, but I would agree with that to at least a partial piece. I think the institutional church and progressive churches are struggling with this whole issue without any question. And one of the reasons they're struggling with it is that there are large numbers of people who are walking away. And those large numbers of people that are walking away used to be that those were people that you said, okay, they may come back later on, or they really didn't belong in our circles to begin with, or whatever excuses they might use. But now, many of the people walking away are the very best, the ones that have been the most loyal. And they're now walking away, and they're not walking away from their faith, they're walking away from the institutions. And that's true in both progressive circles and in institutional circles. And the interesting thing on that, I might mention in it too, is that what I discovered coming from a evangelical side in ministry, and myself being on that the progressive end of that in many ways, what I discovered was rather interesting and opposite of what you might expect, and that was in the institutional settings. Oftentimes, those were the people who were encouraging living by your design. They were encouraging you to be out where the needs were and taking care of them. On the evangelical side, it was often, even in the progressive side, how can we build our brand, and how can we build our clientele, and how can we build the numbers that are coming here. And but to be honest as well, there were many of them, and many of my pastor friends, and many of those that were evangelicals that simply wanted to follow Jesus. And the system was keeping them from doing it and often frustrated them in what they had to do to keep things going. I don't know if I've answered the question on that at all, but um, it's an, it's a really interesting thing. It's why I finally left the whole of the structure and said, can I work outside of it? Um, because the structure itself seemed to stymie everything that was being attempted and tried by those inside who had great hearts, wanted to do it was right. It ended up being simply slaves to the structure. Any other thoughts or comments on that?
I think I'd like to go back to what you were getting to right before we addressed that question, and that was you were starting to encourage us. I think you're asking us, do we know our own design,
Yeah,
and do we know what's inside of us?
and wondering that because I think that's such a vital thing that we aren't given to. We're given to living in this culture that we've always lived in. But do you know what you're designed to do? Do you know how it is that you work the best and what things intrigue you? And I'd love that to be a discussion, uh, an open discussion on an ongoing basis, because you'll probably find it in some of the areas that you want to read about the most. You'll probably find it in the areas that you've changed the most on in life, because it's usually in the areas of our expertise, or the areas of our strength, the areas of our giftings, the what's inside of us that really intrigues us, that we change the most in life, because those are the things that we're looking at all the time, and we're looking at all of the things around it, and we're saying, oh, no, 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 no. And we are interested in it in areas that we haven't changed much. Um, those probably are not the areas that intrigue us as much. It's kind of like the insurance example I gave. I want I want an insurance agent, and I like a good one now. Now, I want one that really does care about my needs. And I don't mean by that that he's got to be my best friend. He isn't. But I want to like him, and I want to call him, and I want to talk to his staff or him, and I want them to honestly be listen to me and be concerned. But I don't want to think about insurance all day. It just doesn't intrigue me at all. I want somebody else who's intrigued by it to be the expert for me. But there are so many things that I want to be good at in my area of expertise. I can read an article, and it's because of the things that have intrigued me for years, it'll relate to something immediately. And I realize I think out of that all the time. Do you have those areas in your life that you're just good at seeing? You're just, they intrigue you. You think out of them. It's almost like they're natural for you. I would love the discussions to become, what are those things for me? Because I don't think in our culture we've done enough of that. And then begin to live out of that and bring that to the table every time you come to the table, so that somehow we can have those strengths in the mix and not just the ones that we need to keep the corporate structures going. Any other comments or questions this morning? Talk to your family. Talk to your friends. Talk about the things that are important to you. Discover your strengths. Discover who you were designed to be. God longs to use it.
I think that leads us well into part 5 of the book, which we will be starting next week. And part 5 is called Where is Google Maps When I Need It? Which I think is a great perspective on the remaining chapters of this book. And it's not necessarily that we'll have the answers, but it's just, again, encouraging discussion about, so now that we know these things, how do we move forward? Where's Google Maps to show us how to do that? So we're looking forward to jumping into part 5 as well.
And I think Carmen, to mention there, probably I will just be doing steel burning, because even though I wrote that a number of years ago now, 6, 7, maybe even 8 years ago now, I think, um, while I was still pastoring, actually, it still has a great deal of the heart of what we're talking about, and takes us to this point. And obviously that whole section, where is Google Maps when I need it, is a little bit of what we've expressed this morning. We don't necessarily have a Google Maps to show us the way. So we're going to be discussing that. We're going to see that maybe we have the things inside of us and inside the whole of us that it's going to take to make it to where we're going.
Nice. And I'll just add to that. I don't know if this really ties in. Hope it doesn't go down another tangent. But Ben and I were talking before we came on this morning about when we follow our heart. Actually, I'm not sure if we actually called it this, but maybe this occurred to me after that discussion, is when we follow our heart, it becomes sustainable. Because if it's inside of us, that's what inspires us, that's what motivates us, that's what keeps us going. And I think maybe that also becomes part of, as we're looking for these Google Maps. If we're following our heart, yeah, we may run into uncertainty, questions. We're not sure how to do this, but we can continue moving forward because it's what God put inside of us.
What an interesting comment, Karma. That's phenomenal. If you remember our whole talk, I think last week, on living to give, but not letting others take it from us, this whole discussion plays into that as well. Because what the corporate structure has done is it has forced us into this mode of feeling the need to give in certain areas or to give a certain way, but it hasn't brought joy to us. And what happens if we give out of our design is it becomes so sustainable, because we live to give, but it's not just taken from us. It's in the area that we love, and it's joy to give in, and we see the kind of things, and it's where our faith resides, because we see things others don't that are needed, perhaps. And it's just a wonderful concept, and it's so sustainable when we get to that point. It doesn't just drag us down and take the energy out of us. It feeds us with energy. So thank you, Karma, for that comment. That's excellent. We need sustainability in this.
And thank you to all of you for joining us this morning. And we'll wrap up here next week. As Ben mentioned, we'll do the first chapter in part 5 called Still Burning. And I think as you read this, at least for me, when I read this chapter, it resonates, because whatever God has put inside of us, whatever our unique sign is, it just doesn't go away, no matter how we might try to cover up or get frustrated or whatever. It still burns inside of us, which is actually a beautiful thing. So thank you to each of you for joining us. Thank you for taking the time out. We certainly appreciate you, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.